introducing Brandon Byars, who is our market technical principal at Thoughtworks. Brandon is a technologist and principal consultant at Thoughtworks. He has a wide range of experience in multiple technologies and business domains with an interest in applying systems thinking to software development. And Brandon has a particular interest in exploring the social and organizational aspects that allow software development to scale to large teams. So that is the written part of it. I just want to say that Brandon is one real awesome and smart guy. That's how I just say it. And it's really a pleasure to have Brandon here and have him speaking. So I'd like us all to please welcome Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. However, Frankie, Greg, I have some bad news. These people didn't come here today to see you. Molly, where are you? They came to see us, Molly and me. And I'm here to talk about rethinking the Agile enterprise. I thought it fit well with the theme of a Rethink conference. There were some printed flyers earlier that talked about my speech being titled Technology Trends for 2015. That's what we call a bait and switch. I'm going to talk about rethinking the Agile enterprise instead. So a few of you have probably seen this document, and probably all of you know how outdated and old it is, and Dave's going to come up here in a few minutes and kill it anyway, so I thought I'd show it up here just as a requiem before we get started. But it's actually the fact that we have 300 IT professionals who have given up part of their Saturday, with the weather as fantastic as it is today, to hear Dave and Martin talk is a testament to the impact of this document. So I did want to actually open with it. A lot's changed in the 13 plus years since this document was written, though. And this talk is thinking about some of those changes and how we apply some of the thinking that was originally behind this document to how to scale enterprises today. So one of the changes is the scope of Agile. So one of the ways I like to think about Agile is that one of the early successes was taking these things that used to be separate phases of projects like testing and integration and reducing the batch size of them so that we could bring them into process. So if you think about testing, showcasing sort of as a user acceptance, right? The customer proxy, the product owner signs off on a feature by feature and story by story, rather than some phase at the end of it in the scope definition. But in the decades since, we've had some innovations where Agile thinking has extended beyond the original realm of Agile. So we've had continuous delivery, which is this notion that we're going to bring our code into production in smaller batches more frequently. We've had the Lean Startup, which is a fantastic book by Eric Ries, a fantastic movement which says there's market research and we can actually validate our hypotheses in the market quicker in smaller batches and more cheaply than in traditional methods. And there's this thing called Beyond Budgeting, which predates Agile and has absolutely nothing to do with Agile, but it has everything to do with agility. We've also seen Agile, we've seen attempts at scaling Agile. Why are you guys laughing? So we've seen a few attempts at this. So it's grown in scope, it's grown in scale as well. So you have SAFe being the methodology du jour for growing Agile into an enterprise scale. Scott Ambler, never one to be left in the trenches, has created something called Disciplined Agile Delivery, which actually incorporates SAFe, which I love. There's this sort of arms race on these enterprise methodologies, and there's a big not invented here syndrome that goes along with them. And I think they suffer from two flaws. First, there's an emphasis on doing Agile rather than on being Agile. And secondly, I didn't create them. So today I'm here to fix that problem. So that's me. I'm Brandon. I work at Thoughtworks. There's my phone number. So this talk is based on this question: what prevents us from being Agile at scale? And I use the word being Agile rather than doing Agile quite intentionally. I hypothesize there's a handful of reasons that I've seen anecdotally in organizations that introduce paralysis. Some of them quite counterintuitive, this one being one of the most counterintuitive of all of them. We think business alignment's a good thing, and it is, but there's some research that came out of a Harvard Business Review article that surveyed 500 CIOs in the Fortune 1000, and they rated their organizations along two axes, business alignment and IT effectiveness. And what you find in the upper right and bottom left is predictable. Most companies are in the bottom left. And if you say that the IT spend over some time frame is at the 0% in the bottom left, and we measure everybody else relative to that, then what you find is if you are a highly effective, highly aligned organization, then you spend less, which makes sense. And over a 3-year time frame, you make more revenue. So this is a top-line revenue growth that has nothing, in theory, to do with IT, but it's significantly greater in the upper right-hand quadrant. What's counterintuitive is that the path you take to that upper right-hand quadrant matters significantly. So if you focus on building the engine of IT, and you focus on IT practices, XP practices, continuous delivery, then you actually spend less than anybody in IT, and your top-line revenue growth is still good. However, if you take the opposite path, if you focus on business alignment first, then it's worse than having done nothing. You actually spend far more and earn far less than anybody else. And this is one of those correlations do not prove causation studies, so there's no good reason why. But since I'm up here to just hypothesize a bunch of ideas, my hypothesis is that what I've seen anecdotally is companies tend towards over-customization of software towards the business users, and if you don't have the engine of IT to execute that over-customization, then it leads quite naturally into the second cause of paralysis I have up here, which is tech debt. We've all seen tech debt. Tech debt is one of those fractal problems that exist in the code base. And there are some techniques, including some techniques that those two fellows in the back wrote about, to help us address tech debt. But there's also tech debt at a systems level. So the more you integrate systems together, the more coupling you introduce into the enterprise, the harder it is for the business itself to adapt to market realities, not just the systems that support the business. And I have this notion that traditional software processes feel very productive when you first start, right? Because you're not paying the cost of testing and integration, you're delaying those costs. But as soon as you start to hit the actual testing and integration, your productivity drops precipitously to some asymptote. With XP, which brings in a lot of the engineering discipline that amortizes the cost of testing and integration, I believe that your productivity starts off lower. And then as you build up enough of team capability and the foundations, your productivity increases. And this roughly corresponds to what Martin back there calls the design stamina hypothesis. But then what I've experienced is that after a point, there's sort of a slow decay beyond that. So even with the best XP teams in the world that I've seen that have 5 or 7 year time spans of length, they still talk about having to deal with tech debt and the decay in the code base, and they're not as productive as they were in the early days. So my hypothesis is that good agile engineering practices delay but do not prevent entropy in the software. So centralization, a lot of IT is built upon this notion of economies of scale, which is the notion that the more you do something, the lower the unit cost of doing that something is. And you see this manifest in IT organizations when you have functional silos, so you have DBAs and you have centralized QA. You see this also manifest in standardization. There's this, it's a horrible term, but resource fungibility is the notion that I could take developers or QAs or whatever from one team and move them to another team. And I can reduce the switching cost of that by having standard tools, standard processes, standard frameworks that they're using, because it reduces the unit cost of them moving from one team to the other. And there is value in that. Economies of scale is a very real thing, but it quickly dips into a diseconomies of scale. And moreover, the more you focus on the unit cost, treating activities as units of production in the manufacturing sense, then the less you focus on flow. And this is one of the lessons of Toyota and lean thinking, is that when you treat sort of work in progress in the system as a liability rather than an asset, then your mindset shifts, and actually what Toyota found was that the overall end-to-end costs of the system go down. And finally, budgeting. And I'm a developer, and as a developer, I was very slow to recognize the corrosive impacts of budgeting in IT, but I felt obliged to put the appropriate Dilbert cartoon up here. Budgeting is pervasive in IT. Budgeting is typically an annual process. In some organizations, it actually takes 6 months and tens of thousands of man hours to put together the budget. because this is big design up front, writ large in the financial statement, as or what budgets are. And then we are measured in IT primarily against our ability to estimate. We are measured against the budget. The governance mechanism in IT is budget and time, and when we have variances, then we have to explain them. So how many of you who work in large enterprises feel like this sort of encapsulates what the enterprise says to you? And so, I mean, there's a few hands, which validates my thesis that I'm not alone in my opinion. It feels like a lot of times we're told to go faster at the same time that the organization's pulling concrete around their feet. And that's not intentional, right? The CIOs, the CEOs would never say that's what they want. They recognize dysfunction. Dysfunction always follows scale. But the trade-offs that are made along the way to bring scale to organizations, I think, tend to focus on the wrong attributes. So there's the story of the three tradesmen. A traveler, they apparently all do the same job. And a traveler goes up to the first tradesman and says, "What do you do?" The tradesman says, "I'm a stone cutter." And he goes to the second tradesman, he says, "What do you do?" And the tradesman says, "Well, I'm a craftsman. I have an expert skill set at shaping stones just so." And he goes to the third tradesman and he says, "What do you do?" And the tradesman looks up and says, "I build cathedrals." And I think one of the great successes of Agile is that it allows us, as software professionals, to be craftsmen, to feel like we have an expert skill set to shape software just so. But I think we're a long way away from building cathedrals, and I think that that's a dysfunction of current enterprise design. So thank God I'm here to fix that problem. So I take inspiration from Kent Beck when he thought of extreme programming. The metaphor he used was, hey, if these things are good, if testing and if code reviews and integration are good, let's turn the knob up to 11. Let's do them all the time. Let's have test first design. Let's have pair programming. Let's have continuous integration. And so I want to take the same idea. Let's take some ideas that I think are good in terms of enterprise design and turn the knob up to 11 and see what happens. But there's one important difference between what I'm going to present here and what Kent presented, which is that I've never actually done any of this, so I'm sitting pretty firmly entrenched in my ivory tower so far up that I can't even see the ground, which is my way of saying, kids, don't try this at home without parental supervision. So when Kent wrote 2 editions of extreme programming, and the second one was far more sophisticated and far more extreme, but nobody ever read it. And in both of them, he took this idea of I have values, principles, and practices, and nobody really cared about the values and principles. So in the spirit of that, I've condensed them into one slide, just so we can get them out of the way quickly. I'll just talk about a couple of the values and principles. Trust. So Spotify is an organization that actually has, as well as anybody, scaled agility. And they've done so, they haven't done so with SAFe. They've done so by allowing a lot of local autonomy at the team level to make decisions. And one of the things they said that really resonated with me is that agility at scale requires trust at scale, and I believe that to be true. I believe that if you're going to trust your employees to do something, then it is it's sending the wrong message to put them in some standard process box. You have to allow them some flexibility. There's something called the first law of cybernetics, which says that the tighter the targets, the goals that you have in the system, the more flexibility you have to allow at the front lines to deal with those goals. And then there's a number of principles which you'll see throughout this talk. Decentralization is going to come up quite often in the practices that follow. And I'll talk a little bit about this last one, devolving accounting to the value centers. So what I mean by that, the value centers are the groups that are the front line. They're either dealing with the customers or they're building the product. And the more that you can devolve accounting and accountability to those groups, I think the more agile you'll allow your organization to be. And I emphasized accounting here because I think if you follow the money, the accountability naturally follows that. So I have a few practices that go into this thinking. I started with my least controversial. The most controversial ones are coming up later, and I heard that Venkat was passing around a bag of rotten tomatoes, so I'd save them for the end as we get more controversial. But the first practice is this notion of products over projects. So McKinsey wrote an interesting article that was called, "What if IT's customers are external?" And the problem with enterprise software is that you have a captive audience. the business users really have no choice whether to use the software you write or not, and oftentimes they're quite resistant to the change. And what McKinsey discussed in this article is that if we were instead taking the metaphor or the mantra of product companies who have external customers, there's two big differences that they face. One is that they have to be a bit more customer-oriented. This is kind of obvious, right? They're competing in the competitive marketplace, and they have to focus on things like customer support and a little bit more face time with the customer. But the other side of that coin was that they have to ruthlessly balance customization versus cost. It's very hard for a product company and its feature set to have its costs skyrocket out of control, whereas in enterprise IT, it's not uncommon for enterprise systems to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars range because of super customization. And I think that's quite interesting. I think over-customization of enterprise software is one of the biggest wastes that we have in enterprises. So this one, this is my attempt at dealing with budgeting, and I'm not really sure if it's quite right. But so the problem with budgets is that we estimate them up front, and then we're governed in accordance with our ability to meet the estimate that was originally provided. Venture capital has a very different model. Venture capital says, I'm going to give you a bucket of money, and you have until the exhaustion of that money to prove to me that what you're building is worth further investment. And the conversation, therefore, is around the value delivered rather than on the variance to the original budget. And I think that is an enormously valued conversation. The core difference I'm not really sure how to deal with is that in venture capital, that bucket of money also includes your salary, whereas in enterprises, that's probably not what you want to have part of the money that's provided for the project. But I think that there is some notion of the way we fund projects discourages emphasis on the value of the delivery and encourages it on the accuracy of the estimate. And a venture capital funding model seems closer to the ideal of having a value-based discussion. And it also forces you to get some value proposition proven early, which is hard. It's a good forcing factor for things like continuous delivery and lean startup, but it also means that you might take creative ways of proving your value proposition. And one of those ways is actually to de-emphasize automation and to focus on business process. And this is the opposite of what I've personally seen in a lot of enterprises who lead with automation and lead with an idea that says, we're going to force the organization to fit inside this workflow because we dreamed it up and we think it's a really good idea. And here's the state machine for which they have to traverse. I've seen, there was a great example that I worked on, this was about 3 years ago now, where the company said, hey, we have this good product idea, and for it to be really valuable, we need this bi-directional integration with the legacy product, but we're not really sure if it's really valuable yet. And so what we did is the legacy system could import and export CSVs, and in the new system, we allowed import and export CSVs, and that was the integration. The business user had to export from one system and import from the other. It was they had this rule share. And that was fine because it allowed us to validate the value proposition of the new software without paying the cost of integration, because integration is the deepest coupling you get in the software systems in an enterprise. And integration is a good thing as long as it models the business process correctly. But if we lead with automation as a way to control the business process rather than to enable it, then we're taking the variability out of the business user's hands and we're putting it in the system's hands. So this model up here is Steve Blank's. He calls it the 4 stages of the epiphany. This is one of the inspirations for the lean startup. And my hypothesis is that a lot of companies who start with a business idea for enterprise software assume that it's a good idea and start in this company building phase, which is saying, now we've proven it's a good idea, let's scale it, let's fully integrate it. I actually think that there's a lot of value in starting over here and starting with some business process validation of the automation that's intended to support, and then working your way to tighter and tighter integration. And this is one of the many lessons from Toyota. Toyota always talks about understanding how to enable flow before understanding how to automate flow. So full life cycle ownership, this is the Amazon model. You build it, you run it. One of the things in this dream world that I'm presenting here is that as many of the costs as possible you want within the product team, right? So this is the operations, this is the infrastructure. And the more of that you can put within the product team, the more you can capitalize, and the more ownership that product team has over the process. And if you can get cradle-to-grave ownership within a single team, then you've established pride of ownership, because now they own it end to end. And you've also established sort of a single point of it. There's no handoffs in the process, right? You've given as much accountability to the value center as possible. So this is potentially controversial. I first heard this from an architect named Stefan Tokov, and it really resonated with me when he said it, because I've gotten into a lot of trouble sharing code within organizations. It sounds like a good idea. We all love reusability. Reusability is great. But the problem is that if I have a library that I want to reuse between two teams, and I make a jar or a DLL, and I require both teams to use it, now I have a coupling problem between those two teams, a coordination problem, right? If I want to change that library, I have to coordinate that change amongst both teams. And so what Stefan said was, if you're going to share code, binary code, like you can always copy and paste, that's always fine. But if you're going to share binary code, then host it publicly in GitHub or somewhere. And I thought that was brilliant. Because, for a number of reasons. One, this is something that Netflix has talked about. The fact that you're going to host it on Netflix means that people have a little bit more interest in writing tests and documentation, because now it's open source and their sort of ego is at stake. But also, it means that you would never share domain logic on GitHub. And sharing domain logic is one of the most pernicious things I've seen in organizations, where they say, here is a user class, and the user over here more or less looks like the user over here, so let's just write it once and then share it. But the problem is that more or less is everything. Because the user over here isn't exactly the user over here, and when you want to flex it, you now, again, you have the same coordination problem. And the fact that we're talking between two different systems and two different business departments, the user actually means something slightly different. This is Eric Evans' whole bounded context notion. So replaceability is a first possibility. I met Adrian Cockcroft several months back. Adrian Cockcroft was the lead cloud architect at Netflix, and Netflix has some fairly mind-blowing practices around the microservices architecture. But one of the things that Adrian said that really astounded me was that their definition of done was that they built it, they've deployed it to production, they've used it, and then they've thrown it away, and then it's done. Not too many companies can meet that definition of done, but that's how flexible they are with deploying new services. I don't really know, so the idea here is that we think about replaceability while we're building the thing that we intend to replace in the future. I have a few ideas of how to do that, but it's complicated. I'm not really sure if they're right. A couple of ideas that I do think are in the picture at least is one, the way that we capitalize it, the way that we amortize it is over a lifetime. If you have an asset which has benefits over a certain time frame, then you're allowed to amortize the cost over that time frame. If we intentionally shrink that time frame for funding purposes, then we put some financial pressure on replaceability as a first-class cross-functional requirement. And also, I think it's pretty clear that if you are building enterprise data warehouses, or enterprise service buses, or enterprise anything that sits in the middle, then you're going to have deep difficulties with replaceability. So that the more that you can sort of decentralize those systems, the more likely you are to be able to replace them in the future. And this is how I address that slow decay that I think always follows software development. You always have some slow decay over time. So the more that you can build replacing the system into the development of the system, I think the better off you'll be. So shared services. Shared services are groups like DBAs and operations and support that are universal in IT. And the notion of dissolving shared services is, again, this notion of devolving accountability to the value centers, to the product teams. So this is a value stream map, something that came out of Toyota. And one of the primary causes of waste that Toyota identified was this wait time in between handoffs. And a lot of times shared services act as gates on the way from development to production. And the problem is that they're always overutilized. The DBA group is always overutilized. So they never have time to act on what you need them to act on when you need them to act on it. And the notion of dissolving shared services doesn't mean that database administration all of a sudden disappears, because that role and that skill set always has to exist. But it means thinking about it and organizing it a little bit differently. It could mean that within the product team that you have database administration skill sets. It could mean that you have some experts in your organization that have DBA expertise, and they are treated as internal consultants, assuming that the utilization of that group is low enough to have spare capacity. It could mean that you allow your product team to hire external consultants to bring that skill set as needed. But the idea is that the product team owns the delivery of the software, and not the shared services group acting as gatekeepers along the way. And I don't know how far you can actually go down this path. There are groups like security and compliance, and I'm not really sure if you can dissolve security and compliance. But the mindset is let's push as much of that accountability to the front line as possible. There is, however, one shared service that's also built on this notion of economies of scale that's a little unique in terms of its scale. However, this way of thinking would cause us naturally to question it. And I admit that I'm a little nervous speaking in front of 300 IT professionals, standing up here and saying maybe we should dissolve IT. But let me explain what I mean by that before you start throwing the tomatoes. Again, the skill sets and the roles don't disappear. But I can, and I don't know, right? There's desktop support, there's data center, IT means a lot of things. But I can certainly pleasantly imagine software development reporting to the business unit for which it supports. I can imagine myself as a developer reporting to sales or to marketing rather than to IT. And I can imagine the conversation around the value delivered being much different than around the compliance, the budget, and timeline, which exists within the centralized shared service called IT, if that were the case. I'm unaware of any company that's actually done this. The company that's come the closest I'm aware of at scale is Inditex, best known for their brand of clothing called Zara, which is a European brand. They're the same order of magnitude as the Gap. The Gap has very sophisticated IT systems, but they take 9 months to go from a design of the shirt to having the shirt represented in a store. Zara can do it in as little as 2 weeks by following all the practices that we just talked about. They've given the store so much local autonomy that they can actually talk to suppliers and staff and purchase new shirts on demand. And they pay higher unit costs for that. But they still make an amazing profit revenue because their flow is so amazingly good that their ability to adapt to market conditions is better than anybody else. They have no centralized IT. Now my data on their IT systems is a few years old, so I don't know how up to date it is. But the data I have is they have no centralized IT systems, IT department. The stores have tremendous autonomy. There are some centralized IT systems. For example, the point of sale systems have to register orders for corporate. And those centralized systems were approved by top management. However, Zara emphasized business process over automation to the point where they have 1/4 of the spend on IT as other companies of their scale. And consequently, they have much better flow as well. So this is my new manifesto. I hope you guys don't mind back there. I rewrote the manifesto. This one I like better because it's got my picture in the background. But this is thinking about enterprise agility. I took the same metaphor. I said, okay, these things on the right are genuinely good. I genuinely like reusability. I genuinely like standards. However, they butt up quite often with the things on the left. And when they butt up with the things on the left, I value the things on the left more. However, this isn't the typical model that I see in enterprise. They tend to value the things on the right more. I think this is something that is worth challenging. The one trade-off that didn't make it up there is that I value building cathedrals more than I value cutting stone. And I think a lot of this is driven around the notion that we as software professionals have taken a lot of our craft back, but we still haven't gotten to the point where we're building cathedrals. So that's it. Thank you.